Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Meg, part of the V&A membership events team, and I would like to thank you very much for joining us for this afternoon's talk. Every ticket purchased supports the work of the museum, including our exhibitions, our education and outreach programmes, and the care of our world-class collections. So thank you very much. Today's talk promises to be an enlightening discussion with Diana Darke about her latest publication, Stealing from the Saracens. Signed copies of the book are available from the V&A website, and of course V&A members do get 10% off when shopping online, so make sure to have a look at that. It really is an extraordinary book. It was named 2020 Book of the Year by the New Statesman, and it already has me absolutely itching to get out and explore all of these incredible sites when we're able to, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Diana in just a moment. Before we do that, a couple of housekeeping points for you. First of all, we are recording the talk today, so if you miss anything or you'd like to listen again, that's fine. We'll send an email with the recording to all ticket holders to enjoy in your own time at a later date, so keep an eye out for that email coming soon. If you have a question for Diana, you can ask these at any time throughout the talk. Just type them into the Q&A box, which appears in the bottom middle of your screen, and I will ask those of Diana at the very end. And finally, we're always announcing more online talks and events by email, so do make sure that you are subscribed and receiving your V&A e-newsletters. But now I'd like to hand over to our speaker for the afternoon. Diana Darke was studying German and philosophy at Oxford University before she decided to switch to Arabic and never looked back. She picked up travel writing as a hobby during her years working for the UK government and has now written 17 books about Turkey and the Middle East. She bought a 17th century courtyard house in the old city of Damascus in 2005 and lovingly restored it, which inspired her to complete an MA in Islamic architecture. She also catalogued her experiences of being embedded in Syrian society during that restoration project and its descent into a violent civil war in her book, In My Damascus House, An Inside View of the Syrian Crisis. Some of you may have been lucky enough to hear Diana speak about that when she last spoke at the V&A in October 2017, and we're absolutely delighted to be welcoming her back, albeit virtually this time. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Diana. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Meg. It's a great pleasure to be back with the V&A, and I'm looking forward to taking you on a journey. We will start by we're covering quite a large proportion of the globe, but we're going to start at the beginning with the title, which requires some explanation because I keep on getting asked about this. Stealing from the Saracens, how could you go for such a controversial title? And I should explain that this title has been chosen with great care. It is a deliberate double irony because it's based on the Arabic derivation of Saracens, which is from the Arabic saraka, to steal. So Saracens, we called Arab Muslims people who stole. And yet the irony is that we stole, if you like, in inverted commas, from them. So it's meant to be slightly funny. It's a slightly tongue-in-cheek way of attracting the attention, if you like, to what went on here. And the reason that the word Saracens is even in the title at all is because Sir Christopher Wren, when he built St. Paul's Cathedral on the right-hand side there, he said explicitly that when he built the dome, he used Saracen vaulting because, quite simply, it was the best. So that is why the cover of the book is actually showing the interior of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. So the thing that directly inspired me to write this book was the fire at Notre-Dame in April 2019. And when the images of the cathedral on fire went round the world and there was this outpouring of huge grief, and specifically from within France and within Europe, of our national identity is being burnt, it's being destroyed. And for me, that triggered a rather different reaction because I thought, wait a minute, don't people realize that what you're calling the French identity and the European identity, most of the elements that make up this Gothic architecture are actually originating in the Middle East. And yet that knowledge seems to have disappeared somehow between the Middle Ages and now. So this was part of the reason for writing the book. And Christopher Wren himself said that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. So he was one of the first people to see how many of these elements actually came from the East. So on the right-hand side here, this decapitated statue is Denis, Saint Denis, the martyr, the patron saint of France, and this statue is on the front facade of Notre-Dame. But the reason he's there is he is symbolic of the very muddled history that was quite typical in the Middle Ages, a sort of muddle of identities, because there were three Denises, and their identities all became conflated, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, because there wasn't a huge amount of source material to check up on all these things. So people had to take the word of the most important abbot or bishop who was pronouncing. So the patron saint of France, called Denis, he was thought to be the person behind the philosophy of light, of letting in more light for the Gothic cathedrals at Saint-Denis, Saint-Denis in Paris. But centuries later, it transpired that the identity of this Denis was in fact a Syrian monk from the 5th century, a mystic monk, and it was his work, the celestial hierarchy, that was so influential in the Middle Ages that bishops and abbots were decided to embark on this new style of architecture that was all about letting in more light. So Syrian Denis, as I call him from this point in the book, takes us to Syria. And here we have a picture of what are known as the dead cities of Syria. And these are the most astonishing collection of about 800 settlements with over 2,000 churches in in between Aleppo and Idlib in Syria. And when I talk about Syria, by the way, throughout this presentation, I don't mean the modern amputated state of Syria. I mean the historic Syria, so the whole of the eastern Levant. And so that stretched, of course, all the way from the Taurus Mountains in the north, right the way down to the Sinai, and included Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was part of Syria. And these dead cities in Syria, they represent an astonishing transition from pagan to early Christian architecture. So the churches in this area, and they're all built of the local limestone, which is why they're still so well preserved, are quite stunning, covering really quite a big area. And two of the most famous churches there, the one on the left there is called Kalb Lauze, which means the heart of the almond. And that is one of the earliest churches to show this twin towers flanking a monumental entrance, the early Romanesque style. And the reason that that style evolved was because it was on a pilgrimage route. The pilgrimage route to St. Simeon's Basilica, which is the building on the right-hand side. And St. Simeon's Basilica, which was completed in 490, was in its day the most important shrine in Christendom. So pilgrims came from this country, from all over Europe. They walked to go to that shrine, to get souvenirs, to pray. I mean, it had the most astonishing, it was the Santiago de Compostela of its day. And that little stump on the rock there is all that remains of the pillar of St. Simeon, because St. Simeon Stylites preached from his pillar. And it's worth mentioning that in May of 2016, even what we're looking at there, those remains, were blown to smithereens in a Russian airstrike, because we must never forget this area is still under aerial bombardment. And today is actually the 10th anniversary of the ongoing Syrian war. So this whole area is still subject to Russian and Syrian government airstrikes. Now, St. Simeon himself, as I said, was so influential across Europe that villages, towns were named after him in France. So on the left there is the stained glass window of St. Simeon on his pillar in the village of St. Simeon in the department of Seine-et-Marne, just east of Paris. And on the right-hand side is St. Simeon on his pillar in a mosaic, and that one happens to be inside St. Mark's Basilica. So his influence was colossal, incredibly, incredibly important. And all the architectural styles that were evolving there in Syria were brought back to Europe by early pilgrims, early monks. I mean, Irish monks were sent to Syria to find out about monastic architecture. I mean, it was recognized then that this is where all of early Christian architecture developed. And the skill of the early Syrian stonemasons is quite extraordinary to see. So here, this is still St. Simeon's Basilica. So remember, this dates to 490. And this is what's known as the swaying acanthus leaves on top of the pillar there. Incredible detail, this sense for nature, the sort of, you can almost see the movement. And there is a column, a capital exactly like this inside the nave of Notre-Dame Cathedral, which shows you that Syrian masons were on the move and the styles were traveling between different countries. And this briefly takes us to the V&A, because in the V&A we have the extraordinary cast court, which was built 25 meters high to accommodate Trajan's column here, this astonishing plaster cast. And the reason I'm showing you this is because the architect engineer was Apollodorus of Damascus, Trajan's favorite architect, and he introduced several Syrian architectural traditions into the Roman vernacular. So he is even credited with bringing in the dome, which first developed in Eastern antiquity. So when we look at the Pantheon, we tend to think, oh, that's Roman, but all of its antecedents are much, much further east. And it's worth remembering that so much blending of civilizations has already taken place in the multicultural, multi-ethnic Roman and Byzantine empires. So that is what was already there in historic Syria when the first Muslim conquest came in, the Umayyads, and the first building, the first political statement that the Umayyads built was the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And some people look at this building and think, well, it's just a copy of the Byzantine basilica. But it's not at all. When you look more closely, there are many things that you see that are different. Yes, it has synthesized a lot of the previous elements, but it's also got very, very new styles. So for a start, the mosaic decoration is on the outside, whereas with all basilicas, the mosaic is on the inside, and the exterior is always very plain. But not only that, inside, when you look carefully, you see two innovations which never existed in Byzantine architecture. At the bottom, in the arcade of the arches at the bottom, you see the first beginnings of a pointed arch emerging. And just below the dome, in that little arcade of tiny arches, you see the first trefoil arch. So the pointed arch and the trefoil arch, you see them here for the first time in early Umayyad architecture. Byzantine architecture has neither the pointed arch nor the trefoil arch. So these are Islamic innovations. And these things evolved and synthesized in all Umayyad buildings. So the other key Umayyad building is the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which has always been the sacred heart of the city. It began as an Aramaean temple to a weather god, and the Greeks turned it into a temple of Zeus. The Romans turned it into a temple of Jupiter. The Christians turned it into a cathedral of John the Baptist. And then when the Muslims came, they too wanted to use that same space. And so for a period of nearly 100 years, they actually shared the space. They entered through the same gateway and Muslims turned one way and Christians turned the other. And that arrangement only came to an end when they physically ran out of space. And at that point, the Umayyads said to the Christians, we would like to take over this space now and convert it into our own mosque. And in exchange, we will give you the land for 4 new churches in the Christian quarter. And to this day, those churches exist in the Christian quarter. And on a Sunday in the old city of Damascus, you still have church bells ringing out, mingling with the call to prayer. And when you look at this building, you can just see how blended the architecture is, how it's incorporated elements from the early Byzantine churches. So the square campanile has become the Jesus minaret here on the right. And this is very typical, again, of the blending of Christian and Islamic folklore, because the belief is that Christ on the final day of judgment will descend from this minaret. Then you have the dome and you have the Hellenistic gable. So all these elements have been synthesized into something completely new. And this is a detail of the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, where you can see more closely in the mosaics on the inside courtyard, how again, all these early elements have been synthesized in early Islamic art into something completely new. So you have the triple arch there, the triple window, which is the same as what they will have seen in churches all over Syria, representing the Trinity, and the columns of the classical build sites like Palmyra, the capitals and columns. But the iconography is totally different. You have visions of paradise, essentially, gardens and rivers and streams and trees full of fruit and fantasized buildings. And again, you have the detail of the little trefoil arches there inset over on the left. And the Umayyad early architects used these styles in their secular architecture as well. So here, this is actually the entrance to the Damascus National Museum, and it is a recreation of one of the Umayyad desert palaces. And notice how they've adopted these twin towers in front of a monumental entrance, like in Kalblausi, the early church, but here they're using it differently. They've made the towers round, and the absolute detail of the carving, this carving is very typical of Umayyad palaces. This is from Qasr Mushatta, which is actually on display in Berlin, in the Islamic Museum there. And you can see again this astonishing command of early stonemasonry, that the local limestone, it's almost moving with this fusion of nature and the abundance of and fertility. Everything is fused in there in a completely new way. And another innovation in early Umayyad architecture is what many scholars see as the first rose window on the left there. This is in an Umayyad palace called Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is actually in what is today the occupied West Bank near Jericho. And the excavators did an incredibly thorough job and found that this window, this decorated window, was placed high in the audience chamber of the main palace. And there were even little fragments of colored glass beneath it. So its function was clearly to let in decorated light, in the same way that then centuries later, the stained glass rose window reached its absolute apogee in Chartres Cathedral there on the right-hand side. And glass is something, again, where we have to mention the astonishing collections at the V&A, where I have spent literally hours studying some of these collections. The stained glass gallery up on the first floor is really worth a whole day, basically. And what I discovered in the researches for this book is that the raw materials for all these stained glass windows in the cathedrals all came from Syria. It was all shipped across from Syria, and up until the year 1401, when Tamerlane sacked Damascus and took all its craftsmen back to Samarkand, up until that point, Syria had been the world leader in glass. And this was recognized by everybody at the time. And so when stained glass windows were being developed, Crusaders, for example, when they captured these parts of Syria, started to ship back in large quantities, large amounts of these raw materials from Syria, with particularly this special organic flux, a special kind of salty plant called ushnan. And when the Venetians took over, they basically took all the materials and the techniques from Syria after 1401, when Tamerlane destroyed the Syrian glass industry, and the Venetians then became the top dogs. They kept it all secret, kept the recipes secret on Murano Island, but they actually specify in those recipes that they must have the cinders of Syria, as they call them. So on the right-hand side there, this is an astonishing goblet called the Luck of Edenhall, which is in the V&A. It is exquisitely beautiful, and you can see how strong and beautifully crafted the glass is. You see these tiny bubbles in it. And this is what gives the early glass, the 12th century stained glass windows, this wonderful magical quality, this sort of organic unevenness. It's almost the impurities in the glass that give this mysterious light, which you're never going to get from any new restoration. And glass analysis has shown now that early glass in Canterbury Cathedral, in York, in Saint-Denis, and in Chartres, that the raw materials are all of what is called the Islamic composition. So the raw materials have all come from Syria. So that is a brief overview of the Umayyad the first Islamic empire, and the architectural innovations that they had. And now we move to Spain, because when the Umayyads came to an end in 750, because the Abbasids killed them all off, one Umayyad prince escaped and made his way across North Africa, all the way to Spain, where he set up in Cordoba a capital where he mimicked everything that he knew about his homeland in Damascus. And so the Cordoba Mesquita, as it's known, is using all these same elements in the late 8th century that were developed during the 7th century in Damascus. So you have the minaret, which of course today is the bell tower, because here what was the mosque has been converted to a cathedral under the Reconquista, and you can see how it goes up in registers, as they're called, becoming more ornate as it goes towards the top. And then inside the Cordoba Mesquita, for the first time in the extensions of the mosque built by Abdurrahman's successors, you have for the first time this astonishing vaulting, this Saracen vaulting that Christopher Wren was so struck by. And this dome is directly above the mihrab in the Cordoba Mesquita, and it was examined for the first time by engineers from Spain only a few years ago, and they were astonished at what they found there. They pronounced that it was the most astonishing example of geometric perfection in a dome that they had ever seen, and it has not needed any structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. And this level of comprehension of geometry was not known in Europe, in the European mainland at the time. So this is another innovation that came into the European mainland from the skills of Muslim masons. And at the back wall of the Cordoba Mesquita, there is a whole display of the names of the masons. These are the masons' marks. And when you look closely at the names, they are overwhelmingly Muslim. There are just one or two Christian names amongst them, but most of them are Muslim names. And so this again shows that it was the skills and experience of the early Syrian masons that were responsible for these huge advances on the European mainland, things that had never been seen before. So you can see how here in Spain, the trefoil arch has been elaborated along the top of the mihrab there. the whole of the Cordoba Mesquita is a paradise of arches, arches everywhere, inside and outside. Every gateway is covered in arches of all different types, interlocking, pointed, horseshoe, ogee arches, multifoil arches, as here, with a slightly incongruous crucifix put in because they've turned all the exterior walls into chapels. There are now 40 chapels going around what was originally the mosque. And here, the multifoil arch here is actually in the Cordoba synagogue, because the Jewish community also adopted the Islamic styles and from choice used them in their synagogues. And when they too were driven out in the Reconquista of Spain, when they were forced out and built their synagogues elsewhere, they used the same Islamic styles as they had known in Spain. And the pointed arch, another way that entered Europe, it's very interesting to learn about all these things, which were recorded by the monks themselves of the major abbeys of Europe. So the Benedictines, who were the most powerful at the time. So on the left here, you have Amalfi Cathedral on the coast of Italy, and the Amalfans were trading heavily with all the Islamic cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And on their trips, their trading trips there, they noticed the pointed arches of the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo. And the Abbasids had further developed the pointed arch, so it had become more noticeable than it had been under the Umayyads, and it was developed further by the Abbasids in Samarra, their capital, and then later in Baghdad. So by the time of the Ibn Tulun Mosque in the 10th century, the pointed arch was quite striking, and the Amalfi merchants liked it very much and said, we want that in our cathedral. So they imported the laborers, the craftsmen, and imported some of the materials. And then a very influential abbot from Monte Cassino, Benedictine monastery, came to visit Amalfi to buy some luxury goods and noticed the pointed arches, and he also liked them and said, I would like those in my monastery. And so he too imported the labor and the raw materials. And then the abbot of Cluny, the absolute powerhouse of the Benedictines, visited Monte Cassino, saw the pointed arches there, and he too said, I would like to use this now in Cluny as well. And so once Cluny had adopted the pointed arch, it became all the rage that everybody wanted to have the pointed arches. And of course, it fitted with this philosophy of letting in more light. And so everything evolved in that direction. And because of the Benedictine control of the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, all the styles from northern Spain and the ones that had made their way in through the other gateways like Sicily and Amalfi found their way into these Cluniac shrines on the way to Santiago de Compostela. And you suddenly find all these elements in cathedrals like this one at Le Puy in central France, where you have the Ablac stone, the patterned arches there, which is direct Syrian Umayyad borrowing. You have Kufic inscriptions, and you have some pointed arches and the cloisters too. And also at this time now, you start to see in Christian iconography images of God as architect of the universe and using his compass there as the tool of creation. So this signifies that for the first time in the European mainland, the use of geometry is beginning to transfer. So the Muslim masons that have brought in all these advanced ideas are starting to transfer their knowledge and skills into the buildings of the Benedictines. And so gradually these styles and the Gothic cathedrals then start to expand from this new advanced level of geometry. And military borrowings too. The Chateau Gaillard in France, overlooking the Seine there between Rouen and Paris. Richard the Lionheart, on return from the Crusades, noticed many military innovations in the Muslim lands, and when he came back, he built Chateau Gaillard as his favorite castle, using some of those techniques. So you can see the scalloped edges there of the keep, which are much better at deflecting the enemy fire. Now here we have the map of Jerusalem, 15th century map, which is another example, like Dennis at the beginning, of sort of misinformation, if you like, a muddle where it's almost like early propaganda gone wrong, because this map was the first pictorial map ever of Jerusalem. So it was very influential. It was reprinted into many languages across many countries in Europe, and yet what it shows is the Dome of the Rock, sporting an onion dome, which it never had, right in the center, as if this is the main Christian building in Jerusalem. And yet, of course, as we know, the Dome of the Rock is a Muslim shrine. So here, what the reason for this is that the early Crusaders mistook the Dome of the Rock for the Temple of Solomon, and they labeled it as such on their maps. And so it's one of those ironies that so many churches, the round Templar churches, are modeled on a Muslim shrine. In Venice, this is another major gateway for Islamic architecture. At this point in the book, I rely heavily on the work of the architectural historian at Cambridge, Deborah Howard, who wrote a wonderful book called Venice and the East. She devoted 10 years of her life to studying all the connections with the trading empires, again, between the Venetians and the Islamic cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. And she actually concludes that in many ways, Venice is an Islamic city in so many ways. The styles are all adopted. You have the Islamic domes again being used here. You have so many elements that have been borrowed, and even the narrow alleyways are like an Islamic organic city. And you have arches everywhere, pointed arches, ogee arches. In this Palazzo Dario there on the left, you have what's called the telephone dial motif, that round circular motif, which is borrowed off Mamluk palaces in Cairo. On the right, you have the Doge's palace, where again, you have these incredible, delicate filigree styles and the patterned brickwork. All these elements have been brought in from buildings that the Venetian merchants saw and consciously adopted and very much wanted to copy. And they regarded this as the height of sophistication and reveled in the fact that they were using all these styles. And then on the left there, this is Burgos Cathedral, which is again in northern Spain on the route to Santiago de Compostela. So this is one of the Gothic cathedrals that sprang up. And you can see in that style, again, this extraordinary delicate use of ornamentation. And when Wren called Gothic architecture Saracen, he said, you can see from the lightness of its work, the excessive boldness of its elevations, the delicacy, profusion, and extravagant fancy of its ornaments, it could only be attributed to the Moors, or, what is the same thing, to the Arabians and the Saracens. That is his conclusion. And then when you look on the right-hand side there, also in Spain, you see the absolute astonishing revival building, Gothic revival of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, where all these elements, again, have been fused by the architect Antoni Gaudi. And this building is still under construction. In 2026, it will be the centenary of Gaudi's death, and that is when they're hoping to complete it. But all those elements that I've been talking about as characteristic of Islamic architecture are to be found in this remarkable building. And Gaudi himself acknowledged the debt he owed to Islamic architecture, and he said, in a way, he's like the perfect fusion of nature, geometry, and religion. And he says, I am a geometrician, he said, and that is to say, I synthesize. He completely understood what this sort of expression of this fusion of religion and geometry and nature and the abundance of nature. This is a detail of the Sagrada Familia, where again you can see how similar it is to some of that early Umayyad secular architecture. It's the same thing of this sort of expression of energy and nature fusing together. And so with the Gothic revival then of the 19th century, we see all these styles coming back. So we have in London the Houses of Parliament, we have Big Ben going up in registers, becoming more and more ornate as it gets to the top. And the Houses of Parliament themselves are covered in trefoil arches, pointed arches everywhere. We have buildings that are complete follies, like the Regency Pavilion down in Brighton, which is what was called neo-Saracenic or neo-Mogul, and where you have fantasy onion domes and minaret chimneys and multifoil arches everywhere. It became all the rage again in the 19th century. And in France, you have Montmartre, another Gothic revival building, and on its own website, it admits that it borrows heavily from Islamic architecture, from the domes and the styles inside. And Montmartre itself, the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, is marking the spot where Denis, our original Denis, the martyr, patron saint of France, died carrying his head. And so that is what is actually being marked there. And then these styles in the neo-Gothic phase moved over to America as well. So what we're looking at in this image is the Washington National Cathedral. And look at it, you've got your twin towers, the monumental entrance, you've got it covered in pointed arches, trefoil arches, it's got the rose window, all these elements of Gothic architecture that are traceable back to the Middle East. And again in America, no country anywhere in the world has more Gothic architecture in its colleges and universities than America. So Yale, for example, these two images are both of Yale, which is a very Gothic campus. On the left there is what's called the Harkness Tower. And on the right is the main library, the lending library, one of the main lending libraries in Yale, which looks for all the world like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. And then the Capitol Dome itself in Washington, D.C. uses the same Islamic vaulting system that Christopher Wren talked about with his St. Paul's. And you can see it here in this double dome technique that was Saracen vaulting that was being used by Wren, and then in all the later domes was used again in America. And so the point of the book really is to show how all these elements from different cultures have interacted and interwoven across the centuries in ways that we need to understand, and in ways that challenge, if you like, the fact that we Europeans invented all these things. We have to appreciate that so many of these styles did actually originate elsewhere and were then gradually synthesized in different ways. And this, to my mind, also helps with the appreciation of things like Gothic cathedrals and gives you a deeper understanding of the backstory of these buildings, which is all to the good. And I certainly now look with new eyes at all Gothic cathedrals, and my appreciation of them has been greatly enriched. And I do hope that if you read the book, you will feel similarly. So that's it now. I will stop sharing my screen and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Diana. I appreciate, you've covered such an enormous range of time and geographical area. And the book itself as well just covers such an enormous amount. It's really kind of astonishing. So thank you so much for that. And we do have some questions coming in. Of course, if you have any questions for Diana, please do pop them into the Q&A box. But our first one is about how this knowledge was transmitted. So of course, we're assuming there isn't a huge amount of sort of printing. Obviously, there were no printing presses at this time when a lot of this transference was happening. So the question here is all of this knowledge simply transmitted by the stonemasons and the craftsmen themselves? It's literally about just people moving and bringing their knowledge with them.
Yes, and pilgrims moving. So it's merchants, pilgrims, and craftsmen moving. And the remarkable thing is how much people did move. I was genuinely surprised to see how much everybody was on the move. And we know this because, as I said, there are very detailed histories written by the monks at the various abbeys. So there was a figure called Leo of Ostia, who I mention in the book, and he records in great detail how the abbot saw the arches at Amalfi and imported the labor and the raw materials. So elements like that are known. There are specific incidents where we know exactly how it entered. And it's probably worth me saying, actually, that the book is fully footnoted. So for the sources of everything I've been talking about, it is all fully footnoted. And to a large extent, other people have done all the work for me. What I have done is come along and put together a huge circular jigsaw, if you like, using the pieces that everybody else. So as I mentioned, Deborah Howard focused on Venice. So for 10 years of her life, she researched that one area. The whole Umayyad architecture. There was a wonderful man who's sadly now died, called Robert Hamilton, who became the keeper of antiquities at the Ashmolean in Oxford, and he spent decades researching the Umayyad architecture. So again, he had done all the hard work. So I was able to come along and I started to see it as a sort of giant circular jigsaw and put all these pieces together to give the whole picture. Because I'm not an academic, academics by their very nature tend to focus on one field, one area. But I was able to sort of take a more big picture view. And so that's why, yes, it is very wide ranging, and it's deliberately so to try to make it accessible to the general reader.
Thank you. So obviously, as I mentioned in my introduction, it's made me really want to go and travel and visit a lot of these places, and an enormous amount of stuff that is in the book, especially in the earlier chapters, is looking at sort of these sort of early medieval sites in Syria, which are absolutely beautiful, and these incredible structures that are still standing after sort of 1500 years or so. And we have a couple of people in the audience asking if it's possible to visit Syria, when did you last visit, and asking about your beautiful house and how it's doing, obviously under very challenging circumstances in the country at the moment.
Yes, well, the dead cities that I focused on early on, which are this astonishing repository of early Christian architecture, because obviously there was nothing that we could recognize, obviously, as a church until Christianity became an official religion. Before that, it was sort of more underground, but they were being persecuted, obviously, by the Romans. So churches were just in houses. And the earliest one of those was found over in Dura Europos, over on the Euphrates, right in the east of Syria. So the dead cities show the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries of all that architecture, and that is most of those sites are in the province of Idlib, which is under the opposition, or Assad would call them all terrorists, but of course, because they are the opposition, they are subject to bombing from Assad's air force and from the Russian air force in support of Assad. So quite a bit of damage has taken place. So you cannot really visit at the moment. It's almost impossible, and the border with Turkey, which is the only way to get in, is closed at the moment. So you can't go there to those parts at the moment. But I was last in that part of Syria just before the war. Actually, I did a big tour around that area in 2010. So I have a lot of photographs still of what everything looked like at that point, which have turned out to be extremely useful. I have been back into the regime-held areas, into Damascus, 7 times during the war. So I have seen what has, the way everything has changed and what has happened. And since it is the 10th anniversary, it is worth remembering that 55% of Syrians have lost their homes in this war. I mean, it's just a figure like that. If you just imagine in this country, over half the population being displaced from their homes. I mean, it is just unbelievable what has happened there. But as to my house itself, the old center of Damascus has not been affected by the war. I mean, just 1 or 2, small mortar shells have landed in the old city. No real damage at all. Very, very minor. But the suburbs, of course, where a lot of the informal housing, as it's called, in other words, where poor people live in the suburbs, that is what has been completely destroyed in the war. So the suburbs of Damascus have been flattened to a large extent. But the old city is pretty much as it ever was. So my house, was able to actually serve as a refuge for, families who had themselves lost their homes. And it is still lived in now by a friend and his family. It hasn't been damaged at all. It has a collection of bullets that have landed in the courtyard, which have been kept for, but no actual damage at all. And the same goes for everywhere in the old city of Damascus. It has been spared, if you like, because it never fell into opposition hands. So there was no reason to bomb it from above.
Right. I mean, it's nice to hear that the house is doing well, and also fantastic to hear it's being put to such good use to house people who've unfortunately lost their homes elsewhere. I have another question here. You've talked a lot about the sort of where people may or may not have realised that what they were copying or using was Islamic, where people may have sort of fudged a bit and pretended that it wasn't when they knew what it was, and the sort of way that we understand these architectural innovations in a lot of places as actually being European, when of course you've clearly proven that they're not. So we have a question here about how deliberate you think that has been, or has that kind of happened just as a result of the way that information was moving around and the nature of sort of society at the time this was happening? Or has this been a bit of a sort of a propaganda campaign to erase that contribution on the part of Western thinkers?
Well, I think at the time, I don't think anybody, thought much about it. They saw something they liked and they copied it. That is how it always was. And if you were rich, and so the Benedictines, for example, were incredibly rich. They had a lot of money, and they saw something they liked, and they had the money to put it into practice. And they went for the best. Just like Christopher Wren used the Saracen vaulting because it was the best. So if you can afford it, that's what you're going to do. And back then, in medieval times and before, I don't think anybody, minded where it came from. Actually, they just saw that it was better than what they had been using, and so they thought, yes, well, of course, that style looks much better. It means we can let in more light, we can have more decoration, we can make our buildings taller, because of course the pointed arch was structurally stronger than the round Romanesque arch, and that was very well understood. It was a great deal stronger, so it meant you could have thinner walls and taller buildings. But of course they then in the race to make you know, my Gothic cathedral taller than your Gothic cathedral, in the sort of rivalry between the bishops themselves, they would make it so tall that sometimes they really did overreach themselves, and so they had to invent flying buttresses to hold it all up. And then Beauvais Cathedral, even with the buttresses, couldn't stay up, and the whole thing collapsed. So that today you've just got this one section that's still left there. So it's been much more recent, in my view, this whole sort of more Eurocentric way of looking at things. I think this is what happened, you know, well, in colonial times, essentially, where I mean, I'm a product of it myself. You know, the education system I was brought up in was that you thought that Greece and Rome were responsible for all of civilization, and you didn't think about that anything may have come from further east than that. And so it wasn't until I started to study Arabic that I had my eyes opened, if you like, to see that, my goodness, yes, of course, the Greeks didn't invent, you know, that gable. That gable was first appeared from the Aratians in Anatolia, you know, but they saw it, they copied it and brought it in. So, you know, all of these styles moved. But then I think with the sort of slightly colonial mentality that developed, you know, later in the later centuries, we started to sort of appropriate everything. And so, you know, you think about Kenneth Clark and his program Civilization that was done, you know, back when I was a child, as a sort of series of documentaries. Well, it was all Europe. You know, Europe was civilization. There was no civilization anywhere else. And so, you know, I think this is what actually needs to change, perhaps, in our own education system here in Europe, so that we have a more broader understanding of the origins of so many of these things.
I think that's a point that's made so well in the book, is just how actually it's quite difficult to say that anything is specifically from one culture or one place at that time, because there's so much interchange and traveling and sharing that's happening, that everything really is, there's a huge amount of cultural exchange happening at that, in those sort of the late centuries BCE and the sort of early centuries of the Christian era. There was so much interchange going on that we just, seem to have conveniently decided not to talk about so much in Europe anymore.
and also how multicultural and multi-ethnic those early empires were. You know, the Roman empires. I mean, you know, the you know, plenty of the Roman emperors were themselves Syrian. You know, and you're talking about somewhere like Ravenna. Every single bishop of Ravenna up until the year 420 was from Syria. You know, they were all from Antioch. So. But, you know, we don't think of that. We think, oh no, Ravenna is European and this is Christian, without realizing that, of course, Christianity came from the Levant, you know, and that's where it all developed and evolved. So we have to look a little bit further east to get the full story.
The book does a fantastic job of that, I have to say. Slightly different, change of pace now. There's a few people who are asking, which I'd say was a beautiful image of God using his compass to create the world. We have actually a couple of people are asking, if they missed it, where that image is from, where they can see it.
Well, you can Google it. If you just Google that, it will come up actually. But it's in a French manuscript. That particular image. It's in a Bible, I think, an early Bible. I think that one is a 13th century image. But it became quite a common concept at that time, and it's the timing that's significant. You know, that this idea of geometry, the power of geometry in creating, and God as architect. You know, all of that was very new as a way of thinking. And stonemasons, this is an interesting point actually, stonemasons in this country, so people who understand buildings and early churches and are used to, you know, medieval architecture, they, there's a chap called Andrew Ziminski who wrote a wonderful book just last year, where he actually says in his book how he was very struck by, there was a sudden leap in Gothic architecture. It's as if suddenly everything changed, you know, and he said the only way to explain the sort of huge hike in skill and experience that suddenly came in was because it came in from elsewhere, from the Islamic world. And he in fact does conclude that from what he sees himself. You know, I mean, because I mean, Crusaders brought back prisoners sometimes. You know, Muslim prisoners who were craftspeople. You know, skilled people who they wanted to work on their own castles. And I mean, there are quite a lot of cases of like that being recorded and indeed being discovered all the time. I'm quite struck by it. More and more is being discovered about how many Muslims, skilled Muslim craftspeople, were brought over, and there are little signs here and there in cathedrals where you get the signatures. You usually find them when there's some sort of restoration program. So a part of the cathedral is being delved into that nobody's looked at for a long time, and then they discover little marks and you know, Arabic numerals and stuff like that, which just show that there were Muslims working on these early buildings in a way that was definitely new.
Well, that sort of leads me on to another question that we've had, which is about sort of these stonemasons. And I don't know if we would necessarily use the word architects at this point, but the people who are responsible for actually erecting these buildings, and how much of the innovation comes directly from them, and sort of how did the trade of being a stonemason work? I know you do go into this a bit in your book at various points, but if you could talk a little bit more about how stonemasons moved around and how their work was sort of distributed.
Well, really, if you think about it, it's sort of common sense. So if you were a skilled stonemason, you were called on to work in the areas that were prosperous, where they needed new buildings. And so in the Dead Cities, for example, that's why so many masons were working there at the peak. But then the trade routes changed. I mean, their wealth was built on olive oil trade. When the trade routes changed there, those early settlements lost their income, and so all those skilled people became economic migrants essentially, and there was no work for them anymore, no livelihood. So they left that area. It was all abandoned, and you know, they will have gone to Antioch, to Constantinople. You know, they will have gone to wherever the next building program was. So 50 years after St. Simeon's Basilica, for example, you know, Justinian was building Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and would have needed many skilled people. So, you know, he would have summoned the best of what was available, because again, you know, if you're going to make an incredibly important political statement building, you've got to have the best, the top people working on it. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess and fall down. You know, if you just get the local chappies round, you know, you've got to get the top people who really know what they're doing with this kind of thing, cutting edge technology as it was then. So, you know, that's why people go to where the work is. And again, this is recorded. So in the Umayyad and the Abbasid empires and caliphates, for example, when a new caliph who was particularly wealthy started a new building program, all the craftsmen would be moved en masse to build a new palace somewhere. You know, vast numbers of them, because again, you couldn't just rely on the local labor force. That wouldn't have produced the building that you wanted. You know, so so again, it tended to follow the money, basically. You know, so whoever had the money and was doing the big building projects like the Gothic cathedrals. So, you know, as Spain, as the Muslims were being pushed out of Spain under the Reconquista, a lot of them will have gone north into, you know, the south of France there, where the Cluniac shrines were being built. So their skills were obviously in demand there instead. So it is, you know, if you think about it, it was ever thus, really. They were early economic migrants moving around to where the work was. It's quite an itinerant lifestyle.
So we do still have lots of questions coming in. I'm sorry, we won't be able to get to all of them. We have so many, and lots of them are echoing the sentiment that they really enjoyed that talk. Diana, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. I think we've got time for one last question before we let everybody go, which is about sort of I think in the modern day, we really associate architects with very complex architectural drawings and having lots of paperwork and someone sitting at their desk and making these elevations. Are there any sort of paperwork or plans or any architectural designs from any of the periods that you cover that are sort of extant that have been used sort of to influence your research?
Well, this is a very, very interesting thing, because the Gothic architects didn't have, there is nothing written down. I mean, that is what is so extraordinary about it. That's what makes it so difficult to do a restoration program like Notre-Dame, for example, because nobody knew how these buildings were built, and people don't even know the names of who was in charge, because by and large the sort of religious bigwig, whoever he was in charge, he took the credit. So with Saint-Denis in the north of Paris, where the first Gothic styles were used, Abbot Suger, who was in charge there, he puts himself in the stained glass windows, talks about how he did this and he did that, and so nobody else much gets the look in. We simply don't know until later centuries, where you start to get the name of a mason or a key person. So in those early phases, we don't have the name of who was responsible, and this actually sort of fits with the whole Islamic sense of things, that the fact that things are more organic, that things kind of evolve. If you look at a Gothic cathedral, everything is crooked, everything, nothing lines up, the walls are wonky, and yet it's as if it all holds itself up through some astonishing organic magic, that's just sort of done by some sixth sense in the person building it, which is why when people tried in later centuries to just restore one bit of it, that often went horribly wrong, because by tinkering with one bit of it, the whole harmony of the rest of the building was dislodged, and bits of the rest of it would fall down that had appeared to be all right before. So it is this very sort of organic quality, which is something that I sense in Islamic buildings as well. It's something about the way, it's the complete opposite of the sort of very linear box-like structures. It is something that you sense on walking into a Gothic cathedral, which is, nothing is aligned, everything is slightly random, like nature. There is no right angle in nature. It's as if it is a sort of building representing nature. It's that very powerful sense that comes through, which, with all our wonderful technology and rebuilding of Notre-Dame, I'm quite sure that what they come up with at the end of it will not have the same sense and magic to it as the original did.
Well, I mean, all the more reason for us to protect and care for those cultural monuments that we still have. Of course, we'll be following the case of your house in Damascus, and hope that makes it to the end of the conflict, and hope that conflict comes to an end soon. Thank you so much, Diana. The book is absolutely fascinating. It covers so much, and there are lots of questions coming in, and I know for a fact that lots of those questions will be answered in the book, which you can purchase from the V&A website online. You can use your members discount, so definitely do that. And thank you so much, Diana, for your time, for that absolutely fascinating sort of romp through 1,000 years of architectural history or more. It was absolutely enlightening, and it was a delight to have you. Thank you to everybody who joined us in the audience to listen, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.